Welcome to Critical Issues, Alternative Views. I'm Ron Kramer from the Department of Sociology at Western Michigan University, and I serve as the host of our program. And joining me today for our chat about the military budget and the federal budget are Regena Nelson, who's in the Department of Teaching, Learning, and Educational Studies at Western Michigan University, and of course Don Cooney, who is a professor in the School of Social Work at Western and also is a Kalamazoo City Commissioner and the Vice Mayor, right? You also hold that particular title. So we know that there's a lot of discussion going on right now about the debt crisis, the debt limit crisis. And I thought that it might be good if we sort of took a step back and kind of looked at the federal budget more broadly. And one of the issues that's long been a concern of mine, and I know probably yours as well, is the military budget, because it takes up such a huge proportion of the federal budget. And if that becomes something that can't be touched or brought down, then that puts pressure for cuts in other parts of the budget that are going to be pretty devastating. So I thought we'd spend a little bit of time talking about the federal budget, which is a really fun topic, right? I mean, who doesn't enjoy sitting around talking about the federal budget, right? But let's get started. And so the first thing I think people need to know about the federal budget is that money comes in, right? Through tax revenues and tax receipts and some other forms of income. So we get all this money in, and then the federal government decides that they're going to spend it, right? So there's the money that's going out. Now, one of the problems is that if you're spending more money is going out than money is coming in, right? And so if that happens, then we have a deficit. We've all heard people talk about the budget deficit, right? So every year, that's usually the case. We usually spend more than we bring in, and so then we have to borrow money, right, to finance the deficit. And the deficit year by year by year, then it begins to accumulate, and so we have a debt, the national debt. So for fiscal year 2022, the federal government spent a trifling amount of $6.2 trillion. But it didn't bring in that much money. And so in fact, it fell short by a little over $1 trillion, $1.1 trillion deficit. And of course that deficit then contributes to the overall national debt, which has now jumped up to $31 trillion. Okay, so a trillion here and a trillion there, and pretty soon you're talking real money. Yeah, so that's where we're at. So the national debt is this accumulation of government borrowing over the years, and it's up there over $30 trillion now. Now, the other important thing before we get into some of the more specifics is to make a distinction within the spending part of the budget, because there's sort of two parts to that. One part is what's called mandatory spending or direct spending. Essentially, this is Social Security. That's the biggest part of the mandatory spending. So sometimes they're referred to as trust funds, right? So we all pay money in every time with our paycheck. We have some money withheld that goes into the Social Security account, and that money is then put aside and earmarked for spending on Social Security at some later date. For us, some of us may already be dealing with that, right? Don and I at least are eligible for that, right? But this spending is not something that Congress can really decide on. Right. This is mandatory. We've paid in, we get the money to come out. Congress can fiddle around and adjust the amount of money that's coming out, maybe usually increasing it a little bit to help keep up with inflation. But generally, the trust funds are over here and not available to Congress to spend for other things, like the military or education or whatever.
But also Medicare.
Medicare is included in the trust funds as well. Very important, Don. Yes, you're right about that. Medicare, Medicaid, I think, maybe.
No.
Is
on
Medicaid
the
part of
other
the
side.
discretionary
No.
budget?
That's
Oh.
discretionary budget.
That's
Yeah.
discretionary, okay.
Yes.
Well, let's talk about the discretionary budget then. So we've got the mandatory spending over
Right.
here, and then Congress has other money that they can spend, right?
Exactly.
What do they spend it on?
Oh yeah, so in the discretionary budget, we have the social welfare programs such as the tax credits, there's the food stamps, there's housing assistance, there's the temporary assistance for needy families, nutrition programs, education, job training, all of those things, but the lion's share is the military budget. And so that's where we see the differences across the aisle on priorities.
Yeah.
Is it the social welfare programs that we're going to cut, or is it the military budget when we talk about making cuts in the discretionary funding of the budget?
Yeah, yeah.
So I would like to add something to that, that there are the social welfare programs included, but also included in that discretionary budget are the other departments, the Department of Education, what do you call it, Department of, all the other departments are included in that. So a piece of that is toward the social services, but there's all these other things in there too. But you're right. What has happened is that's been gobbled up by the military. More than half of it is now going to the
Exactly.
military.
Yeah, I think that Daniel and Larry back in the controls have a pie chart that they're going to put up that shows.
Oh, okay.
Now, this is from 2015, so the numbers are actually a little different now. So, in fact, the military budget now is the current budget was $858 billion. So look at that increase.
Yes, and
Just from 2015.
8 years, yeah.
Yeah, just in 8 years, we've jumped up to 858. Wow. And the Biden request for 2024 is $886 billion. And so the proportions are still almost exactly the same. The military budget, and in fact, the Biden request will be added to probably by Congress. So we might be looking at a military budget over $900 billion. We're getting close to $1 trillion.
But I think that some of the money that goes to the military is buried in other departments.
Yes.
In the energy department, some of the money that is in the energy department is actually going to the military, the education department, and some of the others. So when you add all those things in there, it's over $1 trillion that's going to the military.
In fact, William Hartig, who, if anybody's interested in looking, behind these numbers, the journalist William Harting, who we had here, KNOW brought Harting here to lecture a couple of years ago, but his columns are excellent. He writes a lot for TomDispatch.com, and he also now works for the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, which is Andrew Bacevich created think tank, and they do some really great work.
Great stuff.
So Harting works for them. But his analysis of the federal budget and the military budget is just outstanding. And so anything I say today is probably something I've, cribbed from
all of us.
William Hartig's analysis. But so it's important then to understand that, okay, the mandatory spending's over here. There's been a certain amount of money that Congress does have available to spend. And it chooses to allocate more than half of that money to the U.S. military. That's just the Pentagon space budget. Then, as Don just pointed out, there's other military-related spending that's in there. He mentioned the Department of Energy. There's also Department of Homeland Security has some military-related spending. The International Affairs budget of the State Department. The Veterans Affairs budget is in there. There's defense-related activities with the FBI and the CIA. And there's interest on the national debt due to past military spending. If you add all of that in, which you should, because it's actually all money going to the military in one form or another, then the amount of money that we spend on the military does rise over $1 trillion, and Hartig estimates $1.4 trillion right now, 1.4 trillion, which is just an incredible amount of money if we think about it. The one other thing I would point out, and then we can open it up for some other observations about this, but the one other thing to understand about the federal budget is that the president, the executive branch and Congress try to hide the percentage of military spending. So if we had somebody in here, they say, well, it's only about 20% of the federal budget. What are you talking about? It's well over half of the discretionary budget. But what happens is they combine everything together, right? So they take those trust funds and the discretionary and they mix it all together, and then they pull out the military portion of that pie, and it obviously then is going to be much smaller, right?
So I think it's very important to see how that happened.
Go ahead.
The way that happened was until the mid-1960s, they were separate budgets. And when they talked about the budget, they were talking about the discretionary budget because the other was fixed. But with the Vietnam War, President Johnson wanted to hide how much money they were spending on the military, so he combined the two. So it made it look like they were only spending 20% of the federal budget on the military.
Yeah. Why worry about that? It's only 20%. What's this 50% you're talking about? So that's a really important distinction, the discretionary budget and the mandatory spending or direct spending, mostly on Social Security and Medicare, as Don pointed out. And then again, if you look at a pie chart of the unified budget, the military portion is going to be much smaller. So we mentioned that the current base budget for the Pentagon is $858 billion. The request is for $886 billion. And like I said, pretty soon, $1 trillion here and $1 trillion there, $1 billion here and $1 billion there, and we're talking real money. So let's look at some of the other factors that go into this. Why do we spend so much money? Why is there so much money going to the military?
China. We're afraid of China. That's the main thing. So we have to counter China. But the people that write on this say that the main threat from China is economic and not military. And we spend 3 times as much money on the military as does China. So China is put out there as our great giant enemy, whereas our military and our expenditures far outclass what's happening with them. So that's one thing. The second thing is the war in Ukraine, right? And we've poured already $37 billion into the war in Ukraine. So the military spending, it's both things. It's how much we're putting into our own military forces, but how much we're also putting into other military forces.
And for a long time, they had another section of the budget that was contingency funds that went because that was used to fund the invasion of Iraq and invasion of Afghanistan and the ongoing occupations there. So they had overseas contingency funds, and that was separate from the Pentagon space budget. So in some of the earlier analyses that Harting did, he always had to have a special that category added in to show how that. And so again, now the spending on what's the material and weapons going to Ukraine is probably another kind of supplementary.
Right. That's not just going to the Pentagon. That's right. So. That's right. That's a separate.
And let's see. You were mentioning. I lost my train of thought there. You wanted to add something else in.
Well, I think it's important to put our spending on the military in the context of world spending on the military. And so we spend more on the military than at least the next 6 nations. It's up to 9.
Yeah.
9 nations in the world combined. So it's not like we're catching up here. We're so far ahead and continue to be so far ahead that why are we doing this? I mean, that's at the root of the question, I think.
And that's what I wanted. That was what I was trying to think about. but that's an important point because we do talk about, the threat from Putin or the threat from China, and yet again, our military spending is larger than Russia's and China's and 7 other major powers in the world all combined. And so, like you say, we're spending so far much more than those countries are, and yet we continue to hype the threat. And of course, during the Cold War, the great enemy was the Soviet Union.
Right.
Once the Cold War ended, the U.S. military was panicked. They were in a quandary. The enemy had gone away, right? The Soviet Union was gone. The Russian Federation was our friend. Boris Yeltsin was our friend. And why did we need to keep spending all this money? Couldn't we now have
Peace dividend.
a peace dividend, right? Couldn't we reduce the military budget? And there was a lot of talk about that in the early 1990s. Well, it didn't happen, right? Because the Pentagon quickly moved to fill in what Senator Sam Nunn of Georgia called the threat blank. There was a blank there now. Who was the enemy? What was the threat? Nobody there. We got to come up with something.
Yeah, right.
And so Colin Powell and the Joint Chiefs of Staff at that point came up with the rogue doctrine. And so now the focus was going to be on third world military powers that were the rogue actors, right? So Saddam Hussein fit in perfectly here, right? A powerful military in a third world country threatening his neighbors, perhaps developing, he was developing nuclear weapons, right? Donald Rumsfeld was sure of it. He knew exactly where they were. We could never find them, but Donald Rumsfeld knew where they were. I wonder why Donald Rumsfeld never told the military where to go to find those nuclear weapons if he knew where they were. But the threat blank was filled in then with the rogue doctrine. In fact, Michael Clare, another great analyst, so if you're not reading William Hartig, and you should also be reading Michael Clare, who also writes for TomDispatch.com and also writes for The Nation magazine. And his columns are just a must read if you're interested in these issues. And so Michael Clare wrote a book called Rogue States and Nuclear Outlaws. And that was what Colin Powell and the military were up to, trying to fill in the threat blank, and they successfully did. So now it was going to be Iraq, and it was going to be Iran, and it was going to be North Korea. And remember George W. Bush giving that famous State of the Union address where he talked about the axis of evil. The axis of evil. Well, these were the three, right? It was Iraq and Iran and North Korea at that time. And so the threat blank was filled in successfully. And of course, this led to our interventions, the wars for the greater Middle East that Andrew Bacevich wrote so thoroughly about. The invasion, well, first there was the first Gulf War back in 1991 against Iraq, and then the 2003 invasion and the invasion of Afghanistan after 9/11, and our military involvement in the Middle East, and of course still tussling with the Kims over in North Korea, trying to deal with them, trying to keep them from getting a nuclear weapon, and then they did get the nuclear weapon, and that's been a dismal failure. Even George Bush, who fell in love with Kim, wasn't able to translate his love affair into Kim getting rid of the weapons over there. So the threat blank was successfully filled in, but now China. Don, you hit it right on the head. Everything's China, China, China. And it's almost as if the establishment, that the Pentagon and the military, or the political establishment, political elites want to start another Cold War, this time with China. As you point out, it's primarily the economic, China certainly has emerged as a major superpower, right? In all kinds of ways. Their economy has grown tremendously. And, they do have a substantial military, nowhere near ours.
No.
And they are, in fact, modernizing nuclear weapons. They have only about 400 warheads. We have over 5,000. They have about 400.
Yeah. 9 to 1. 9 to 1.
Yeah. But they are modernizing. They are probably going to increase that. But again, who can blame them if the United States is this 800-pound gorilla out there with nuclear weapons? talking smack about you and calling you a threat in every possible way. And of course, Donald Trump famously got us into a trade war with China. So again, all this talk about China, and while again there's some real reasons to be concerned about China, its human rights record,
right? That's right.
It is increasing its military spending. It is an economic power, but so much of the talk about China is inflated. Just this tremendous inflation of the threat there, and of course that serves the purposes of the Pentagon.
Yeah.
Who else does it serve the interests of to talk about an inflated threat from China? Who else benefits?
Oh, the weapons, the weapons manufacturers. They're very pleased with this. The amount of money that is going into these companies is enormous. And Hartung, in one of his articles, talks about their increase in their since the Ukraine war started. Because we're spending on China, and now we got to spend on Ukraine, and so these guys are making so much money. It's incredible, and they're becoming much more powerful, and they're using their power in several ways. One of the ways they're using their power is in elections, putting a lot more money into the campaigns of people who on the Armed Services Committee and people that are supportive of the military spending. The other way that they're spending their money is in lobbying. They have the military complex the military industrial complex has over 900 lobbyists in Washington, almost 2 for every single member of Congress. And then the third way, which is more subtle, is, and I haven't researched this enough, but in the movies, Top Gun, and other things like that, putting money into these things which glorify. So we are increasing their power, their control, and their influence on the budget, what is happening, because they're getting so exactly as President Eisenhower warned us.
Yes.
Yeah. This is interesting because if we're talking about using the military to prevent potential conflicts, what are the conflicts that we're facing right now? It's the lack of resources due to climate change. So are there other better solutions to reducing these conflicts other than, military spending and potential threats from war? And I think that's something that we need to go into and think about. Is there a better way to deal with this other than this? And how do we raise that awareness around that?
I think that's so important because I think even the Defense Department and the CIA have said that the major threat that we face is climate change. Not a military threat, but climate change, just as you say. Yeah.
But when they talk about the threat from climate change, they begin to talk about failed states and political instability in places around the world, and they begin to talk about climate refugees or climate migrants. And of course then the response is, okay, climate change is going to cause conflicts over here. We got to be ready to respond to those conflicts. Climate change is going to cause all these people to want to try to come across our border. We got to be ready to keep them out, right? This is the politics of the armed lifeboat, right? We're in the lifeboat, we're safe. All these other climate refugees fleeing climate disruptions and disasters are trying to get to safety, and we're going to keep them out the boat at the point of a gun, right? And so this is a form of adapting to climate change, but it's a militarized version of it.
Exactly.
And so the Pentagon is right to be concerned about climate change, but then they again, if you give a small child a hammer, that everything needs to be hammered on, right? What else does the military have as a tool generally to respond to these situations? So they see that armed force is going to be the main thing. Don, you hit on some really important things in terms of talking about why the military budget is so strong, why we have this military-industrial complex identified by Eisenhower. This was his farewell address in 1961 when he gave that famous warning about the unwarranted influence of the military-industrial complex. And I think a lot of people maybe think, oh, some radical sociologist probably came up with that term, right? Some radical anti-war person probably came up with that designation. No, it was President Eisenhower. It was Ike, Supreme Allied Commander during World War II, right?
Republican.
Republican president, staunch conservative. And, you know, in the book I'm working on, I do fault Eisenhower a lot for some of the things he did with regard to building up nuclear weapons. But as he left office after those 8 years, he said, "Wait, we gotta, you know, this is getting way out of hand. We gotta control this." By the way, there was one other very important speech that Eisenhower gave, and it was early. It was early in his his first term, and it gets overlooked a lot. And I think it's an important one. Although, probably when I read the quote from the speech, everybody's gonna recognize it. But this speech happened exactly 70 years ago. It was in April of 1953 when Eisenhower addressed the American Society of Newspaper Editors. And in the course of that speech, here's what he said: "Every gun that is made, every warship that's launched, every rocket that's fired signifies, in the final sense, a theft from those who hunger and are not fed, those who are cold and are not clothed. This world in arms is not spending money alone. It is spending the sweat of its laborers, the genius of its scientists, the hopes of its children." That's a pretty powerful.
Powerful, very powerful.
And this is President Eisenhower in 1953 already. And of course, by the time he left office, he saw that it was getting far, far worse, part of which he did not control the Dulles brothers, one of them who was his Secretary of State, the other was the head of the CIA, and the Dulles brothers were really hardcore Cold War hawks, and they really influenced Eisenhower and controlled his administration's foreign policy. And so we ended up with
nuclear weapons.
We ended up with a huge arsenal of nuclear weapons, and Eisenhower realizing we got to somehow put the brakes on all this at that time. So there's lots of things that end up supporting this, and you mentioned the lobbying that goes on. You mentioned, and again, it's incredible that they have over 900 lobbyists and that they spend millions and millions of dollars in campaign contributions to try to influence elections. And the other thing that the military-industrial complex does, the defense contractors do, is to spread the wealth. They spread the money, the spending around, right? So here, Congressman X, we're going to put a defense plant in your district. Hey, Congresswoman Y, wouldn't you like to have a defense plant in your
employment? We're giving you guys jobs.
We're giving you jobs, and you can go out and brag about that on the campaign trail now, right? And if you spread that out, you start to build in support. So as it turns out, even when the Pentagon says, well, we probably don't need this weapon system, Congress, no, well, you're going to build that no matter what.
Take care of things, not mine.
Yeah, even if you want to cut that, you can't cut it because it means jobs in my district. And so that's another way.
Right.
And by the way, Eisenhower considered using the term military-industrial congressional complex. And he should have done that, right? Because military-industrial, that's only two parts of it. The Congress is there as well. Who allocates this money through the discretionary budget that we were just talking about? It is, in fact, Congress that's involved in this. And again, I always wondered if Eisenhower had read the great book by C. Wright Mills, who was a radical sociologist, by the way. But Mills wrote a book called The Power Elite that was published in 1956, and he identified as the three institutional spheres that constituted the power elite. It was the corporate world, it was the military, and it was the political world, and the people who occupied the top positions in those institutions were the power elite. And I always wondered if Eisenhower had been influenced to some extent by Mills's analysis there, because the military-industrial congressional complex nails it, right? It gets to the power elite.
Wow. Yeah.
What else? Again, I want to come back just for a moment to the point that you made about the entertainment world, and so the mainstream media is complicit here because they don't cover these issues thoroughly, accurately. They don't provide the appropriate historical and social context. So the mass media is to blame. But the entertainment sector, the movies like Top Gun, as you mentioned, these things are enormously influential. And what they do is build up certain kinds of cultural narratives or stories about the United States and how exceptional we are and how we come to the defense of those who are threatened, and how we stood up to Hitler and we defeated the Japanese, and we're exceptional, and it builds nationalism. It builds patriotism, a kind of false patriotism, and false nationalism, of course. And of course, Richard Falk and Robert J. Lifton coined this wonderful term back in the early 80s called nuclearism, which was a kind of a cultural frame in which people clung to the weapons as a way to defend and for the power that they provided to them. And so they actually coined this sort of complex, actually they sort of saw it as a psychological disease almost, nuclearism. But all of that gets built then by the entertainment and the mass media's failures. And one other area, Don, and it is, what other area of society helps to reinforce militarism?
The police. Well, the gun owners.
Think about your Philadelphia Eagles.
Oh, the NFL.
Well, the other things you mentioned are right too. But think about sports. What do we have at the Super Bowl? We have a military flyover. Why do we have a military flyer? Those jets drop bombs and kill people. Why are we having a flyover of them at an entertainment, at a sports facility?
Yeah. You're right. You're right. Exactly.
A veteran who's been injured is going to throw out the first pitch at a baseball game, or at the basketball arena. All veterans stand up and be honored. Again, that's fine. These people have contributed and often have suffered, and they're not being adequately compensated by the government that sent them to do this. But nonetheless, it also helps to build a kind of enhancement of the a mystique of the military, and gets people to emotionally want to support these fine people, right? But then that also influences, well, we got to spend money on the military, right? But spending money on the military somehow doesn't translate down to those people, those veterans who are homeless, who are suffering from PTSD. I mean, CBS News did this whole thing where they were going to raise funds to provide food to needy military families. Why in the world are military families in the United States food insecure?
Yeah.
It just boggles the mind after all this talk about supporting the troops and supporting our veterans, and yet there are families, military families, who don't have enough food to eat because they don't pay them enough money. They don't support them. It's just incredible.
And their families are living in mold infested buildings. They can't get child care. No, it's terrible. They treat the military terrible, right?
Yeah.
And the veterans worse.
Yeah, it's just amazing. All right, we covered everything.
Well, I wanted to talk a little bit more about the importance of this issue, because it really defines what kind of a country we are. I mean, where are we spending our money? I mean, look where we are. Jeff Daniels did that little piece on YouTube. I don't know if you ever saw it. It's from the newsroom thing, where somebody's asking him, why is America the greatest country in the world? And then he begins to say, he tries to evade it, but then he does say, we're not the greatest country in the world. We're 37th in child mortality. We're 127th in reading, 120th in science, all these different things. Because these other countries don't spend their money on these things. They spend their money on their people. But what we've been convinced in this country is this is the only way we can survive. This is the way we have to live. And so what ends up is we end up with terrible poverty. A new book by Matthew Desmond on Poverty by America.
Right.
He talks about this. And our reluctance to invest in our people. One of the things that he points to is how we've been so successful in so many areas of science and technology, yet our poverty rate in this country is about the same as it was in 1972 because we have not invested in those things, because we're invested in stuff like this.
Right.
Look at that pie chart of the discretionary budget.
Right.
All this money on the one side going to the military leaves so little on the other side for so many different, there it is again. Look at all the things on the left side of the chart that are so important, so significant to our life as a society, and yet how little we actually end up spending on those things. Here's just one concrete example out of that pie chart to talk about. So Lockheed Martin produces a fighter jet called the F-35, and it's terrible. It doesn't work. It falls apart. I mean, it can't do its mission. It's just it sucks. It's a terrible plane, and yet we spend millions and millions and millions of dollars, and we can't cut it. And you know, the money that goes into the F-35 program equals in 1 year equals the budget for the CDC.
Wow.
You know, the Center for Disease Control. One plane takes as much out of the current budget as the budget of one of our most important, especially after COVID and with other possible threats out there. And that gives you some sense of the imbalance there. And you know, there are many others, right, Regina, on that side?
Yeah, exactly. So we always look at the education budget and how under-resourced we are. And, you know, right now we're facing a huge teacher shortage because the state budgets and for education just do not have enough to pay teachers the salaries that they need to stay in their profession. So if we could shift some of those monies, and it goes back to that quote that you shared, like it used to be a bumper sticker. What would it look like if the military had to have bake sales to fund their weapons instead of schools to fund what they need to do in the classroom? So once again, our priorities do not reflect the true needs of the average person.
I don't know if people have seen that Michael Moore movie, Where to Invade Next, when he looks at it's all fiction to a certain extent, where he says the Pentagon people are sitting around trying to figure out what we got to justify, where are we going to invade next? So he goes to all these different countries not to look at their military, but look at their education system. What are they feeding their kids for lunch? How are their workers making out? What are they doing about people that are incarcerated? And he shows how all these different countries are doing so much better than us. And they dwarf their resources compared to what we have. I mean, our gross national product is $20 trillion a year, $20 trillion a year. And yet, where do we spend that money for our people? It's so out of proportion.
Right.
And the amazing thing is that they've convinced our people that this is the only path. This is the only way.
What we have to do to be safe.
Yeah.
Exactly.
To defend ourselves. Yes. When actually it's for global domination.
Exactly.
I mean, exactly. The term American empire is often you don't hear it in the mainstream media. Although during the early George W. Bush years, you heard a lot more talk about empire because we were an empire. That
Yeah.
was what the Bush administration was basically confessing. That, and Gary Dorian did that great book, Imperial Designs.
Yes.
Where, again, imperialism, empire, and the goals and designs of the Bush administration, the neoconservatives in the Bush administration, this led to the invasion of Iraq. And so, in fact, we are an empire, and we often don't want to be forthright and admit that. Everybody else in the world talks about American imperialism, but in the mainstream media here, oh, you can't say that. That's a left-wing libel. But it's not. It's the truth. Andrew Bacevich, who was a Vietnam veteran, a colonel in the military, a conservative, wrote a great book about American empire. One of his first best books was on the American empire.
Yeah.
Tom Engelhardt from TomDispatch.com is editor of a series at Metropolitan Books called the American Empire Series, which has produced 20 to 30 really great books analyzing the American empire. So that's another component here. On a broad kind of geopolitical scale, we can talk about the American empire and the push for global domination. Then we look internally, the military-industrial complex, how that then continues this from an institutional and organizational perspective within our society. And then again, you have these cultural narratives, this propaganda that supports it and feeds it and leads people to think this is what we have to do, right?
Yes.
And
Yes.
we're America. We're exceptional. We have to do this. We have to save the rest of the world. We have to be the policemen of the world. And this is all necessary for us to do, despite the great cost it imposes on our own people. Then they think it's a sacrifice that has to be made, I guess. Well, in the time we have remaining, let's focus on a really important current issue, and that is the debt limit crisis that we briefly alluded to earlier. And it all comes back again to many of the topics we've been talking about here. For some reason, I think it was back during World War I that there was a debt limit that was imposed, and Congress has to raise it in order for the federal government to continue to borrow money to pay at least on the national debt, right? And so it's really an artificial thing. It's really not necessary, but it's in there, and
It's not in the Constitution.
it's not in the Constitution.
This is a rule that the Congress has set up.
Yeah. And in fact, it probably is unconstitutional.
By the 14th Amendment.
According to Lawrence Tribe, the famous Harvard law professor, law scholar, it's probably in violation of Section 4 of the 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution, which says that the validity of the debt shall not be questioned, right? But at any rate, so the Congress has to raise this debt. It's kind of a routine matter normally. It's happened over and over. It's happened, hundreds of times over the years that Congress routinely does this. But now the Republican Party, or at least the extremists, and I guess the Republican Party has been captured by the extreme right wing, has decided they're going to use this as a weapon. They're going to weaponize the debt limit crisis, or to make it a crisis. The debt limit, where normally at least 3 times under Trump it was automatically passed with no questions asked, no problems. But now with Biden in office, they're going to use this as a weapon, and they're going to take the federal budget hostage.
Right.
So really, they're economic terrorists. Paul Krugman, the New York Times economist, columnist, called them economic terrorists. They've taken the federal budget hostage, and they're going to kill it. They're going to kill our economy unless we give in to their demands. And what are they demanding? Massive cuts on the left side of that pie chart.
Right.
The right side, military budget, no, you can't touch that.
No.
But all the savage cuts have to come on the left side, all the domestic programs on the discretionary budget side. Oh, what about the money coming in? How about if we reverse the tax cuts that the Trump administration imposed? That cost $2 trillion to the budget. Oh, no, you can't touch that either. You can't undo the tax cuts. You can't bring in more money that way. You can't cut the military budget, despite the fact that it's the most gargantuan part of the budget. The only thing that we can cut are the things that help people, right? Education and health care and welfare. Only those things are dangerous and have to be cut to reduce the size of government and to reduce the debt. I mean, this is just utter nonsense.
It is.
Right,
It's
exactly.
framing the issue. And the issue, the way it's framed, is the real problem are these people who are on food stamps and getting public health care, whereas every other country in the world gives them regular health care.
Exactly.
And these people, and when you look at the people that they're talking about, people are working. The only ones
Right.
not working are the people that are taking care of early kids or people that are handicapped. This is the problem why we can't pay this debt off, because of these
Yeah.
poor people.
Yeah, it's not going to make a big difference.
And they want to put limits or what?
Yeah, so the thing they're saying is that we have to have these work requirements for people to receive this welfare from the government. And there are studies that show that that does not reduce poverty, because once you go out into the workforce, you have more expenses. So whatever you're earning keeps you right back where you were when you were just receiving those benefits. And so there are other things that we have to do, other types of support that we have to have to families, so they can get out of poverty. If this is the real focus of why we want to make these work requirements, then this isn't the way to do it. There are other ways to do it with more support to families so they can afford those things and work and take care of their families and be there to nurture their children and to get out of generational poverty. So we need to look at increasing that side of the discretionary funding actually to reduce poverty rather than this plan that they have.
So the real challenge is not ending welfare, it's
Yeah.
ending poverty.
Exactly.
And ending poverty is a whole different strategy than what they're putting out there.
Exactly.
So we have this crisis now that has been created by the Republicans, and the politics of this are that so the Republicans recaptured the House of Representatives in the midterm elections last fall by a very narrow margin. They were expected to do much better, but it was but by a very narrow margin. They do control the House of Representatives, and Kevin McCarthy, as the Republican leader, wanted to become the Speaker.
Yeah.
And the only way he could get enough votes to become the Speaker is to play to the most extreme wing of his party to gain their votes. And so to gain their votes to become Speaker, he promised them that he would take the economy hostage, as they were asking. They were demanding that he do this, and use the debt limit as this weapon to force the Biden administration to roll back some of its accomplishments in the first 2 years of the Biden administration and to slash even more from the discretionary side of the budget. McCarthy is a very weak man. He's a coward. He couldn't stand up to them. He wanted so much to be Speaker that he gave in. He's the weakest Speaker of the House of Representatives that we've ever had. He actually has no control. Marjorie Taylor Greene and Matt Gaetz and the other extreme right-wingers control him. They pull his strings, but they forced him into this position. And so now, So the House of Representatives needs to pass this increase in the debt limit, or the United States is going to have to default on its loans. And the deadline is coming right up. Maybe by the time this airs, it'll already be resolved. June 1st is the deadline. Something has to happen before then. And my concern is that the Biden administration seems to be caving in to some extent and negotiating with these terrorists. These economic terrorists. And there's talk now of some kind of a compromise. Well, I don't know how you can compromise. I mean, what are you going to do? Cut that discretionary spending? Even if you don't cut it as much as they're demanding, you're still going to cut it to some extent? What? And again, if tax cuts are not going to be on the table to rescind the tax cuts, or you're not going to talk about military budget, you're not going to talk about cutting veterans affairs money, where are you going to cut? What are you going to do? And I can't believe that Joe Biden is going to cave in and agree to these cuts, because he does have some other options, I think, to work with here.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's very, very scary. The way it's framed, the way it's presented in the newspaper, I don't know why the mainstream press isn't challenging this more and saying, hey, this is not the issue. The issue is rich people have to start paying their fair share. We have to stop these tax breaks to these people. And we have to look at a military spending, and even if you want some military spending, let's get more rational about this. That's not even being presented in the mainstream press. It's just this debate here. This is the struggle, and they're presenting the struggle without looking behind that at what's going on. And I think that's devastating. I'm really scared about this because we cannot default. We cannot default.
Oh, it would cause economic devastation.
Right.
Worldwide, probably.
Yeah.
Was what people are saying.
Right.
And again, what we're talking about here is paying the bills that have already
Yes.
due.
Yes.
Right.
This is money that Congress already allocated and instructed the president to spend. It's not about the current budget, and yet that's what the Republicans are demanding, that there have to be savage cuts in the budget. When raising the debt limit is only about paying the bills that we already have, right? Paying what we already owe. You can't stiff people if you owe them money, right? Well, Donald Trump does all the time. But you're not supposed to stiff people that you owe money to. And that's what we're going to do if we default. So again, I thought at first Biden was trying to say, look, you have to increase the debt limit, then we'll talk about the budget for next year.
Right.
That's what he started talking about. Now he seems to be mixing the two together and compromising. And I don't know for sure. Maybe this is just Biden trying to be as reasonable as possible, trying to come up with a bipartisan bill that would, work to satisfy everybody. But I just don't think it's possible because
I don't either.
the demands
That's what
on the
scares
Republican
me.
side are so extreme. And I don't think, and again, if you're not going to talk about tax cuts and you're not going to talk about the military budget, then I don't think there's any discussion to be had there. And so I'm just really concerned that the Biden administration is going to cave in. We don't know that. Maybe there are things going on behind the scene that we don't know, and maybe they are planning, because they do have several other options, right? And we don't have a whole lot of time, so just very quickly, one option is that 14th Amendment that I mentioned.
Yes.
Lawrence Tribe says, look, according to Section 4 of the 14th Amendment, you are required to spend that money, Mr. President. That money's already been allocated. The debt of the United States cannot be challenged, and you can just go ahead and ignore the debt limit. It's unconstitutional. You can go ahead and you can spend that money, and you're supported by the 14th Amendment. You don't need to go to the courts. You don't need to go to Congress. You can just do it. You can say, I'm following the Constitution. I'm following the 14th Amendment. Here's what I'm going to do. A more wild card option is the platinum coin that you could mint for like $3 trillion. And according to the economist James Kenneth Galbraith, you could do that. Congress has already authorized the U.S. Treasury to mint coins, and they can do it in whatever denomination they want to, so they could just mint a coin. It's worth $3 trillion, and that solves the problem as well, because it allows them then they have money to spend to pay the bills, and we don't default on our loan. So those are two options, and both of those actually, as wild as they might sound to some people hearing them for the first time, both are real. Both could avert the crisis. And it would allow Biden to stand up to McCarthy, the weak speaker, and the extremist faction of his party, and say, no, we're not going to do this. We're not going to allow you to hold us hostage. We're not going to allow you to crash the world economy because of your extreme views. And again, they can't pass this legislation in any other way, right? Their ideas are wildly unpopular. Hardly anybody really supports what these people want to do. This is the only way they can do it, is to hold a gun to our collective head and demand that we do this or they'll shoot us. That's what they're trying to do. They can't pass it in any other way. Their ideas are so unpopular. But because they now have control over McCarthy, and they can remove McCarthy in an instant if he doesn't do what they want, this is the situation that we find ourselves in. And it's just, I don't know, I think it's incredible.
Yeah, and it's extremely dangerous. They got 2 weeks. 2 weeks to do this whole thing. And they're far apart right now. And one of the other crazy aspects of this whole thing, if they do what if they give in and do what that's not going to solve the problem at all. How much money are they going to save when they make these people do work? No, it's
Yeah.
ridiculous.
Yeah, you really can't, you can't accomplish dealing with the budget deficit
Right.
and the national debt by making cuts on that side.
Yeah.
There's just not that much money that's there. The debt is still going to be there. And again, if you're going to allow these tax cuts to still go out to the millionaires and the large corporations, then there's no way to handle the debt in that.
And another piece of this that reality-based is much of the debt that we have is coming from Republican presidents.
Yes,
yes,
they've increased the debt much more than
Much
the
more than the
Democrats.
Democrats
Yeah,
did.
yeah.
So now they act like they've been fiscally responsible, where Reagan was totally unresponsible, and so was Trump.
Yeah.
So those guys got us in this position, and then they say, okay, well, now you have to do this because look what happened. Yeah, look what happened. You did it.
Well, we're out of time. I wish we could continue this discussion. For people that are interested, there are organizations out there locally. Kalamazoo Nonviolent Opponents of War works on the issues of the military budget. Nationally, there's the National Priorities Project. The American Friends Service Committee also is a wonderful organization, and it has a Friends Committee on National Legislation, and they work on this issue. So if you want to get involved locally, you can contact Kalamazoo Nonviolent Opponents of War, or you can join one of these national organizations and participate in dealing with this budget issue. So again, thanks to Regena Nelson, Don Cooney, our great crew back there, John Provancher, our floor director, Larry Mahannah, and Daniel Smith. Thank you for being with us. Please come back and visit us again on Critical Issues, Alternative Views.